On a freezing January morning in Washington, D.C., 18-year-old Barron Trump slipped away from his Secret Service detail for a quiet walk, trying to escape the renewed spotlight of his father's return to the presidency. What he found in a forgotten alley would unravel a 50-year-old mystery and connect two families through an act of courage that spanned generations. When Barron spotted the shivering homeless veteran huddled against the cold brick wall, he could have walked past like everyone else. Instead, he took a step that would change not only the veteran's life, but would uncover a debt his family never knew they owed. That simple act of kindness was about to reveal an extraordinary story of heroism, sacrifice, and the powerful bonds that connect us all. Little did Barron know that the man in the tattered military jacket was more than just another homeless veteran. James Cooper carried a secret that connected him to the Trump family in ways that would bring everyone who heard their story to tears. All it took was one look at the mysterious numbers tattooed on Cooper's wrist to set in motion a chain of events that would touch countless lives and remind America what it truly means to be a hero. The January wind whipped through Washington, D.C.'s streets like an angry ghost. Barron Trump pulled his wool coat tighter around his tall frame, his breath forming little clouds in the early morning air. At 18, he was old enough now to shake off his Secret Service detail for short walks, though he knew they followed at a distance, trying to blend in with the early morning joggers and coffee-clutching government workers. He checked his watch. 6:45 a.m. The city was just waking up, but he'd been unable to sleep. Again. The past week since his father's return to the presidency had been a blur of cameras, shouted questions, and whispers that followed him everywhere. "Look, it's him," he heard someone murmur as he passed a small group waiting for a bus. Barron kept his eyes forward, pretending not to notice. He'd had years of practice at that. The reflecting pool stretched out before him as he approached the Key National Mall, its surface rippling slightly in the winter wind. He remembered being 13 during his father's first term, how everything had felt so overwhelming then. Now, at 18, it wasn't any easier, just different. Back then, he'd been a kid trying to grow up in the spotlight. Now he was a young man trying to figure out who he was beyond his last name. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably his mother checking on him. She worried more these days, especially since they'd moved back into the White House. The transition had been harder on her than anyone else, though she never complained. Barron let the phone buzz. He needed these few moments of quiet. A group of early morning tourists walked past, their cameras ready for the perfect sunrise shot of the Lincoln Memorial. One of them did a double take, but Barron had already turned down a side street. He'd gotten good at disappearing, despite being 6'7". His height, which had once made him stand out even more, had become almost comfortable now. Almost. The side street was quieter, lined with old brick buildings and small cafes that wouldn't open for another hour. His stomach growled, reminding him he'd skipped dinner the night before. There had been another state dinner, another evening of having to smile and shake hands while photographers captured every awkward moment. "You'll get used to it," his older siblings had told him. But he wasn't sure he wanted to get used to it. Something about that felt like giving up, like accepting that this was all he'd ever be. Someone's son, someone's brother, a face in political photos. The morning light was growing stronger now, turning the frost on parked cars into diamonds. Barron remembered his old life in New York, how different everything had been. He missed the anonymity of his school days, even though he'd never been truly anonymous. At least then, he'd had a routine, a purpose that was just his own. Now everyone wanted to know his plans. College? Politics? Business? The questions came at him from all sides: reporters, family friends, even his father's advisors. They all seemed to have an opinion about what Barron Trump should do with his life. He turned another corner, moving further from the main streets. This part of D.C. wasn't on any tourist maps. The buildings here were worn, their windows clouded with age and city grime. A cat darted across his path, disappearing into an alley. His father had been different since winning the election again. Softer, somehow, at least with family. Maybe age had done that, or maybe it was everything that had happened between terms. They'd actually had breakfast together yesterday, just the two of them. It had been awkward at first, but then his father had started telling stories about his own father, about learning the family business, about making mistakes and starting over. Barron stopped at an intersection, waiting for the light to change even though no cars were coming. Old habits from his mother's teachings. "You're always setting an example," she'd say, "whether you want to be or not." The wind picked up again, and Barron shivered. Maybe it was time to head back. His security detail would appreciate that. He could sense their growing unease the further he got from the White House. That's when he heard it. A cough, followed by a faint groan. It came from the alley to his right. Barron hesitated. His security training screamed at him to keep walking, to avoid any uncertain situations. But something made him turn. Something about that sound spoke of pain, of need. The alley was narrow, filled with shadows the morning sun hadn't yet reached. At first, he saw nothing but dumpsters and scattered cardboard. Then movement caught his eye. A man sat huddled against the brick wall, wrapped in what looked like an old military jacket. He was shivering violently, his gray beard covered in frost. What caught Barron's attention wasn't the man's obvious homelessness, but the way he held himself, straight-backed even in his distress, like someone who had once worn a uniform, with pride. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Barron's. They were clear and blue, despite his haggard appearance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man coughed again, his whole body shaking with the effort. Without thinking, Barron took a step forward. Behind him, he heard the subtle movement of his security detail closing in, ready to intervene. But something about those blue eyes, about the way the man held himself even in these circumstances, made Barron certain that what he did next would matter more than any state dinner, any photo op, any carefully planned public appearance. He took another step into the alley. The man raised a hand, whether in greeting or to wave him away. Barron couldn't tell, but in that movement, the sleeve of his jacket pulled back just enough to reveal something that made Barron's heart stop. There, tattooed on the man's wrist, was a symbol Barron had seen before. One that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. The tattoo was a Marine Corps emblem, but it wasn't just that. Below it was a series of numbers and letters that Barron recognized from his grandfather's military photos. The marking of a specific unit, one his grandfather had mentioned in his stories. "Sir," Barron said softly, taking another careful step forward. "Are you all right?" The man's eyes narrowed, studying Barron with a mix of wariness and pride. "I'm fine, son. Best move along." His voice was rough but carried a note of authority that years on the street hadn't erased. Behind Barron, Agent Miller cleared his throat, a subtle warning. But Barron had already made up his mind. He shrugged off his wool coat. "I can't do that, sir. Not in this weather." He held out the coat. The man shook his head. "Keep it. I don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," Barron said, remembering something his mother had taught him. "It's one American helping another." He draped the coat over the man's shoulders, before he could protest again. "You're the Trump boy," the man said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Barron nodded. "I'm Barron. And you are?" There was a long pause. The man seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, "Cooper. James Cooper. And you shouldn't be in an alley talking to homeless vets, Mr. Trump. Bad optics, as they say." Barron couldn't help but smile. "I've had bad optics since I was 10 years old, Mr. Cooper. May I sit?" James Cooper looked surprised, but he gestured to the space next to him. Barron sat on the cold ground, ignoring Agent Miller's barely audible sigh. "How long were you in the Marines?" Barron asked. 23 years, 3 tours in Afghanistan." Cooper's voice softened with pride, then hardened again. "Lot of good it did me." "What happened?" Cooper's hands trembled slightly, and not just from the cold. PTSD happened. Bad decisions happened. Life happened. He pulled Barron's coat tighter, around his shoulders. "Lost my wife to cancer 6 years ago. Lost myself after that. Got a daughter somewhere in Ohio," but he trailed off, staring at nothing. Barron noticed a slight gleam of metal near Cooper's collar. Reaching carefully, he pulled out a chain with a purple heart attached. Cooper tucked it back quickly. "Some things you can't leave behind, even when you leave everything else." "When did you earn it?" Barron asked quietly. "That's a story for another day," Cooper said firmly, but his hand lingered on the metal. Barron stood up, brushing off his pants. "Mr. Cooper, there's a diner around the corner. Would you join me for breakfast?" "I told you. I don't take—" "It's not charity," Barron interrupted. "I missed dinner last night, and my mother always says it's rude to eat alone when you can share a meal with someone interesting." He held out his hand. Cooper looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, with the precision of a man who had never forgotten his military bearing, he grasped it and pulled himself up. As they walked toward the diner, Barron noticed Cooper was limping slightly. The older man caught his glance. "Afghanistan," he said simply. "But I was lucky. My buddy pulled me out after the IED hit. Never knew what happened to him after our tours ended." Barron nodded, filing away this information. Something about Cooper's unit marking, the timeline of his service, and that purple heart was tugging at his memory. But he couldn't quite place it. The diner was just opening, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. As they approached the door, Cooper hesitated. "Your security detail isn't going to like this," he warned. Barron smiled. "They don't like most of what I do, but they're used to it by now." As they stepped into the warmth of the diner, neither man noticed the first few people taking out their phones, capturing images that would soon spread across social media. And neither could know that this simple breakfast would set in motion events that would uncover a decades-old story of heroism, sacrifice, and an incredible connection between their families. Cooper settled into a booth, his posture still military straight despite his circumstances. As the waitress brought menus, Barron noticed something else about the numbers below Cooper's Marine tattoo, something that made his heart race. But he kept his expression neutral, even as his mind began piecing together a puzzle whose solution would change both their lives forever. "Coffee?" Cooper asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Yes, sir," Barron replied, pushing aside his suspicions for now. "And maybe you can tell me more about your time in the service. I've always been interested in military history." Cooper's eyes softened slightly. "Well, in that case, but first, you should probably text your mother. She'll be wondering where you are." Barron blinked in surprise. Cooper smiled for the first time. 23 years in the Marines, son. I notice things, like a phone that's been buzzing in your pocket since we left the alley." As Barron pulled out his phone to text his mother, he couldn't shake the feeling that this morning's impulsive decision to walk down that alley was about to become much more than a simple act of kindness. The numbers on Cooper's wrist kept drawing, his attention tickling at a memory of his grandfather's stories. But that would have to wait. Right now, there was coffee to drink and a story to hear. Even if neither of them knew yet just how remarkable that story would turn out to be. The diner's morning regulars tried to act natural, but Barron could feel their stares. A few hastily hidden phones flashed from corner booths. The waitress, Linda, according to her name tag, handled it better than most. She just smiled and poured their coffee as if serving the president's son, and a homeless veteran was an everyday occurrence. "You'll want the breakfast special," Cooper said, not opening his menu. "Best deal in D.C. 2 specials, then," Barron told Linda, who nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Cooper wrapped his weathered hands around the coffee mug, soaking in its warmth. "Your Secret Service detail can relax. I promise not to cause any international incidents over breakfast." Barron glanced at Agent Miller and his partner, who had positioned themselves at strategic points in the diner. They always looked that tense. I think it's in their job description. The coffee seemed to bring more life to Cooper's blue eyes. "Sarah used to say the same thing about me, that I could make watching cartoons look like a tactical operation." "Sarah?" Barron asked carefully, noting how Cooper's expression changed at the name. "My daughter." Cooper stared into his coffee. "She'd be about 23 now. Smart girl. Was in college when He trailed off, his hands tightening. Around the mug. "When was the last time you saw her?" 5 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Cooper said it without hesitation, like he'd counted every one of those days. "After her mother died, the PTSD got worse. Started seeing things, hearing things. The doctors had medications, but..." He shook his head. "One day I just walked out. Thought they'd be better off without me jumping at shadows, fighting battles that ended years ago." Linda arrived with their food, plates piled high with eggs, bacon, and hash browns. Cooper waited until she left before speaking again. "I write to her sometimes. Never send the letters, but I write them. Keep them in a notebook at the shelter when they have space for me. Tell her about my days. Ask about her life. Wonder if she finished school, if she's happy." His voice grew softer. "Wonder if she ever thinks about her old man." Barron cut into his eggs, thinking about his own father, about complicated family relationships, and the words that often went unsaid. "Have you tried to find her?" Cooper's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Wouldn't know where to start. And besides," he gestured to himself, "not exactly in a position to walk back into her life. But if you could? If someone could help you find her?" "Son," Cooper said gently, "I appreciate what you're trying to do. But this isn't some feel-good movie where one act of kindness fixes everything. Real life's messier than that." Barron leaned forward. "Mr. Cooper, my whole life, people have told me what I can and can't do based on who I am. Sometimes they're right. Usually they're not. So let me ask again. If you could find Sarah, would you want to?" Cooper was quiet for a long moment, pushing his hash browns around his plate. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "More than anything." Outside the diner's windows, the morning crowds were growing. More phones were appearing, more whispers spreading. Someone from a news network had already parked across the street. A camera pointed at the diner's entrance. But Barron wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was focused on the way Cooper's hands shook slightly as he talked about his daughter, on the military bearing that showed through despite years of hardship, and on those numbers tattooed beneath the Marine Corps emblem, numbers that kept nagging at his memory. "Tell me about your last tour," Barron said, changing the subject. The one where you earned the Purple Heart. Cooper's expression shifted, becoming more distant. That's not a breakfast conversation, Mr. Trump. Barron, he corrected. And I've heard worse over breakfast, believe me. Politics makes for dark morning talk. A ghost of a smile crossed Cooper's face. Fair point. He took a long sip of coffee. It was my final tour. Standard patrol that turned into anything but. Lost some good men that day. Would have lost more if... He stopped suddenly, his face clouding over. If what? Nothing. Cooper pushed his plate away, though it was still half full. I should go. You've been very kind, but... Take it with you, Barron said, gesturing to the plate. Linda, can we... Get a to-go box? Cooper started to protest, but Barron held up his hand. You don't finish your breakfast, my mother will somehow find out, and I'll never hear the end of it. Trust me, it's easier this way. As Linda boxed up the remaining food, Barron pulled out his phone and quickly typed something. Cooper stood, still straight-backed, despite his obvious discomfort. Thank you, he said formally, for the coat, the meal, and... He paused. For treating me like a person. Same time tomorrow? Barron asked casually. Cooper blinked in surprise. I don't think... I'll be here, Barron continued, with coffee and questions about that last tour. Lots of questions? Something flickered in Cooper's eyes. Worry? Hope? But he just nodded once, sharply, like responding to a superior officer. Then he turned and walked out of the diner, ignoring the now obvious news cameras across the street. Barron watched him go, then looked down at his phone where he'd typed a quick note. Marine Corps Unit Tutor 7, Purple Heart recipient, Afghanistan 2009, daughter Sarah in Ohio. Below that, he'd added, grandfather's story, check dates. Outside, the January wind was picking up again, but Barron barely noticed. His mind was racing, connecting dots he wasn't even sure existed yet. But one thing he knew for certain. Tomorrow's breakfast would be about more than just coffee and conversation. He just hoped Cooper would show up to hear what he had discovered. By the time Barron returned to the White House, his phone was buzzing nonstop. The morning's events had exploded across social media. Video clips of him sitting in the diner with Cooper were already trending, accompanied by thousands of comments and theories about what they had discussed. Your mother wants to see you, Agent Miller said as they passed through security. Barron found Melania in the East Wing, tablet in hand. She looked up as he entered, her face a mixture of concern and pride. You gave away your coat, she said simply. He needed it more than I did. She nodded, then turned the tablet to show him the headlines. Barron Trump's secret breakfast with Homeless Vet. President's son reaches across divide. Political stunt or genuine compassion? It wasn't a stunt, Barron said quickly. I know this. His mother's accent was slightly stronger, as it always was when she felt emotional. But they will say what they want to say. Are you okay? Barron sat down next to her. I think I found something, Mom. Something about Mr. Cooper, the veteran. His unit number, the timing of his service. I need to check Grandpa Fred's old papers. Before Melania could respond, Barron's phone buzzed again. This time it was his sister, Ivanka. Have you seen Twitter? She asked without preamble. The video of you two has over 1 million views already. Dad's opposition is calling it a staged photo op. Let them, Barron replied. I need your help with something else. Remember when Grandpa used to talk about the man who saved his unit in Vietnam? The one he never found? Barron. He could hear the warning in his sister's voice. Whatever you're thinking, I just need to check some dates. And maybe pull some military records. The press is watching your every move right now. If you start digging into military records, then help me do it quietly," he interrupted. "Please, Ivanka, this is important." There was a long pause. "I'll see what I can do. But be careful. Everything you do right now is under a microscope." As if to prove her point, another news alert popped up on his phone. Someone had dug up Cooper's military service record, at least the public parts. The comments were already divided, some praising his service, others questioning why a decorated veteran was homeless, and still others suggesting the whole thing was orchestrated for political gain. Barron's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. His heart stopped when he read it. Sarah Cooper, Ohio State University, class of 2023. Still listed as an emergency contact at the VA hospital in Columbus. He looked up at his mother. "I need to make a call." Melania touched his arm. "Be sure this is what you want to do. Once you start this—" "I'm sure," Barron said, standing up. "But first, I need to make sure Cooper shows up for breakfast tomorrow. And I need Grandpa's old box of Vietnam papers." "In the storage room," Melania said, "behind the Christmas decorations." As Barron turned to leave, his mother called after him. "Your father will have questions." "I know," Barron replied, "but first, I need answers of my own." He headed for the storage room, his mind racing. The coincidences were too perfect, the timing too precise. But if he was right, if James Cooper was who Barron thought he might be, then that simple act of kindness in a cold alley was about to become something much bigger than viral videos and political commentary. His phone buzzed once more. Another news alert. Cooper's background raises questions. What really happened in Afghanistan? Barron smiled. They were asking the wrong questions. The real story wasn't about Afghanistan at all. It went back much further, back to another war, another act of courage, and a debt his family never knew they owed. Now, he just had to prove it. In his pocket, his phone continued to buzz with notifications, each one adding to the viral storm brewing around him. But Barron was focused on something else entirely. A dusty box of papers that might hold the key to connecting two families, separated by time, circumstance, and fate itself. Behind him, Agent Miller cleared his throat. "Sir, your father is asking for you." "Tell him I'll be there in an hour," Barron replied, pulling the box from its shelf. "I need to find something first." As he opened the box, a familiar scent of old paper and memories filled the air. Somewhere in these yellowed pages and faded photographs lay the truth about James Cooper. A truth that would change everything. He just had to find it before breakfast tomorrow. The storage room became Barron's sanctuary for the next several hours. He carefully spread out his grandfather's papers across the floor, creating a timeline of events from decades ago. His phone lay silent nearby. He'd finally turned off the notifications after they became too distracting. "I brought you something to eat," Melania said, appearing in the doorway with a sandwich. She surveyed the papers spread around her son. "Any luck?" Barron held up a faded photograph. In it, a group of young soldiers stood together, their faces dirty but smiling. Grandpa labeled everyone in his unit bomb. Every single person except one. He pointed to a figure standing slightly apart from the others. The face was partially shadowed, but the stance was unmistakable. Military straight, proud. "You think it's him? Your veteran?" "Cooper," Barron corrected gently. "James Cooper. And yes, I think it might be. The dates match. The unit numbers match. And look at this." He picked up a yellowed letter, his grandfather's handwriting cramped but legible. "Still can't find the Marine who pulled us out." Barron read aloud. "Been looking since N69. All I remember is his name was Jim or James, and he had a habit of standing straight, even in the middle of hell itself. Melania sat down carefully among the papers. "Your father is curious why you've locked yourself in here all day." "I know, but I need to be sure before I say anything." Barron picked up another document, a military citation. "Cooper's Purple Heart wasn't from Afghanistan, Mom. That was his second one. The first one..." He paused for effect. "Vietnam, 1969. The exact date Grandpa's unit was ambushed." A knock at the door interrupted them. Agent Miller stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says her name is Sarah Cooper." Barron jumped up so quickly he scattered papers. "She's here? Now? In the Roosevelt room. Your sister is with her." Barron looked at the mess of papers around him, then at his mother. "Go," Melania said. "I will organize these." The walk to the Roosevelt room felt like the longest of his life. His mind raced with questions. Had he been right to contact Sarah? Would she be angry? Would she even want to help find her father? He found her standing by the window, looking out at the south lawn. She turned as he entered, and Barron saw James Cooper's blue eyes, looking back at him. "You're taller than you look on TV," she said. "I get that a lot." Barron gestured to a chair. "Thank you for coming." Sarah sat down, her movements precise, just like her father's. "Your sister said you met my dad this morning." "Yes. And you think..." She stopped, collecting herself. "You think he's connected to your grandfather somehow?" Barron pulled out his phone and showed her the picture he'd taken of Cooper's wrist tattoo. "These numbers? They're not just his Afghanistan unit. They're from Vietnam, the same unit my grandfather served in." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she looked at the photo. "Dad never talked much about Vietnam. After Mom died, he started having flashbacks to both wars. The doctors said old trauma was mixing with new trauma." She looked up at Barron. Is he okay?" "He's surviving," Barron said honestly. "But I think we can help him do more than that. I think we can help him come home." "I've been looking for him," Sarah said quietly. "Every time I see a homeless veteran, I look twice. I've called shelters, hospitals. I even hired a private investigator. Last year." "He writes you letters," Barron told her. "He never sends them, but he writes them." Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back tears. "You said he's coming to breakfast tomorrow?" "I hope so." Barron hesitated. "Would you like to be there?" Sarah shook her head quickly. "Not yet. He needs to be ready. But maybe you could give him something?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been carrying this around for 5 years, just in case I ever found him." Barron took the letter carefully. "I think I know what happened that day in Vietnam," he said. "And I think it's connected to what happened to him in Afghanistan. If I'm right, your father saved my grandfather's life. And the flashbacks, the PTSD, it's all tied together." "How can you know that?" Barron stood up. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." As they walked back to the storage room, Barron's phone buzzed with another news alert. He glanced at it quickly. Mystery deepens. Who is James Cooper? Soon, Barron thought everyone would know exactly who James Cooper was. But first, his daughter needed to know the truth about her father's heroism, not just in Afghanistan, but in a jungle half a century ago, where one man's courage had saved not just a unit, but a legacy. And tomorrow at breakfast, all the pieces would finally come together. He just prayed Cooper would be there to hear it. The next morning, Barron arrived at the diner an hour early. He'd barely slept. his mind racing with all he'd discovered. Sarah's letter sat in his coat pocket, feeling heavier than paper had any right to feel. Linda was already brewing fresh coffee. "Your friend isn't here yet," she said, placing a mug in front of him. "He might not come," Barron admitted. "He'll come," Linda said, with the confidence of someone who'd served countless veterans over the years. Men like that, they keep their word. The morning news played quietly on the diner's small TV. Barron's breakfast with Cooper was still trending, but now there were deeper stories emerging. Veterans organizations were speaking up about the crisis of homeless veterans. Politicians were making statements about mental health care for service members. At precisely 7 o'clock, the diner's door opened. James Cooper walked in, still, wearing Barron's coat, his posture military straight, despite the exhaustion evident on his face. "Wasn't sure you'd make it," Barron said. Cooper sat down carefully. "A Marine keeps his appointments." He looked around the diner, noting the increased security presence and the news van still parked outside. "Though I'm starting to think this might have been a mistake." "Mr. Cooper," Barron began, "there's something I need to show you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the faded photograph from his grandfather's papers. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Cooper took the photo with slightly trembling hands. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then his finger moved to the shadowed figure standing apart from the group. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "It was my grandfather's. Fred Trump's." Barron watched Cooper's face carefully. He spent years looking for the Marine who saved his unit that day, the one who appeared out of nowhere and led them to safety. All he knew was the name Jim or James. Cooper set the photo down very carefully. "That was a long time ago. Was it the same day you earned your first Purple Heart?" Cooper's head snapped up. "How did you—" "The unit numbers on your wrist," Barron said gently. "They're not just from Afghanistan. They're from Vietnam, too. Same unit as my grandfather." He pulled out the military citation. "March 15th, 1969. The day my grandfather's unit was ambushed. The day a Marine named James Cooper earned a Purple Heart, pulling 5 men to safety." Linda appeared with more coffee, sensing the tension at the table. Cooper wrapped his hands around the warm mug, but didn't drink. "Your grandfather," he said finally. "He was the one with the pictures of his kids, kept showing them to everyone, wouldn't shut up about his son in real estate." "That was him," Barron smiled, "always proud of his family." "We weren't even supposed to be in that area," Cooper continued, his eyes distant. "My unit was miles away, but we heard the firefight and—" He shrugged. "You don't leave men behind." "The same way you didn't leave men behind in Afghanistan," Barron said quietly, "when you earned your second Purple Heart." Cooper's hands tightened around his mug. "Different war. Same hell." "Mr. Cooper," Barron reached into his coat. "Someone asked me to give you this." He placed Sarah's letter on the table. Cooper stared at it for a long moment. "That's Sarah's handwriting. She's been looking for you. Never stopped looking for you." A tear rolled down Cooper's weathered cheek. With military precision, he folded the letter and placed it in his pocket without reading it. "I've made a mess of things," he said roughly. "No, sir," Barron replied. "You've saved lives in 2 different wars. You're a hero who lost his way. But heroes can find their way back." He pulled out his phone and showed Cooper a website that had launched overnight. A veteran housing initiative with Cooper's story featured prominently. "What is this?" "A new beginning," Barron said. "If you want it. There's an apartment waiting, and a job helping other veterans transition back to civilian life. And," he hesitated, There's a daughter in Ohio who'd very much like to see her father again." Cooper's hands were shaking so badly now, he had to set down his coffee. "I'm not the same man she remembers." "You're exactly the man she remembers," Barron said firmly. "A Marine who never leaves anyone behind. A hero who saved my grandfather's life. A father who loves his daughter so much, he writes her letters every day." Outside, the morning sun had finally broken through the January clouds, sending streams of light through the diner's windows. Cooper sat in silence, his blue eyes fixed on nothing, his mind clearly racing with possibilities and fears. Finally, he spoke. "Your grandfather, did he ever know that it was me?" "No," Barron said, "but he never stopped looking. And now, 50 years later, his grandson found you instead." Cooper nodded once, sharply, like acknowledging an order. "What happens now?" Barron smiled. "Now, Mr. Cooper, we make a few phone calls, and then..." He pulled out a plane ticket to Ohio. "Then we bring a hero home." The Columbus airport was quieter than D.C., but news of their arrival had still leaked. Photographers clustered near the exits, held back by local police and Barron's enhanced security detail. Cooper sat rigid in his seat as their private plane taxied to a stop. "We can use a different exit," Barron offered. He barely recognized the man sitting next to him. After a hot shower, fresh clothes, and a proper haircut, James Cooper looked every inch the Marine he'd always been. Only his eyes revealed his nervousness. "Marines don't run from cameras," Cooper said, but his hand kept touching the pocket where Sarah's letter was carefully folded. He still hadn't read it. "She's waiting at her apartment," Barron said quietly. "No press, no cameras, just family." Cooper nodded sharply. The word family seemed to steady him. "Your father? The president? He approved all this?" Barron smiled, remembering his father's reaction when he'd explained everything. "He said it was about time someone in the family repaid their debts properly." The car ride through Columbus was silent. Cooper stared out the window, his posture growing more tense as they entered a quiet neighborhood of small apartment buildings. When they pulled up to Sarah's building, he didn't move. "I haven't been a father in 5 years," he said softly. "You've been a father every day," Barron corrected. "Every letter you wrote proved that." Cooper's hand went to his pocket again, touching Sarah's unopened letter. "Maybe I should read it first." "Or maybe," Barron said gently, "you should let her tell you herself." The walk to Sarah's third-floor apartment felt endless. Cooper's military bearing was back in full force, each step measured and precise. He looked like a man walking into battle, scared but determined. Before they could knock, the door opened. Sarah stood there, those same blue eyes that Barron had first seen in the alley, now filled with tears. For a moment, father and daughter just stared at each other. "Your hair's different," Cooper said finally, his voice rough. Sarah laughed through her tears. "That's what you notice first? My hair?" "Marines notice everything." Cooper tried to smile, but his lip trembled. "Sarah, She didn't let him finish. She threw herself into his arms, and suddenly, the proud Marine was crying openly, holding his daughter like she might disappear if he let go. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry." "You came back," Sarah said fiercely. "That's all that matters. You came back." Barron stepped back, giving them privacy. But Sarah reached out and caught his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing my father home." Cooper straightened up, wiping his eyes with military precision. "The letter," he said suddenly, reaching for his pocket. I should keep it, Sarah interrupted. Read it later. Right now, I need you to meet someone. She turned toward the apartment. Mom would have loved her. Cooper froze. Her? Sarah disappeared inside for a moment, then returned holding a small bundle wrapped in pink. Dad, this is Grace, your granddaughter. Cooper's hands shook as Sarah placed the sleeping baby in his arms. His military bearing melted completely as he looked down at his granddaughter's face. She's 4 months old, Sarah said softly. I've been looking for you even harder since she was born. I wanted her to know her grandfather, the hero who served in 2 wars. Not a hero, Cooper said gruffly, but he couldn't take his eyes off the baby. Just a Marine who lost his way. No, Barron said firmly. A hero who found his way back home. Grace chose that moment to wake up, blinking up at her grandfather with curious eyes. Cooper smiled, the first real, unguarded smile Barron had seen from him. Hello, little one, he whispered. Grandpa's home. Sarah wrapped her arms around her father's waist, careful not to disturb the baby. For good? Cooper looked at his daughter, then at his granddaughter, and finally at Barron. For good, he promised. No more running. As the small family went, inside, Barron stayed back. His phone was already buzzing with messages about the press waiting downstairs, about the story going viral, about the impact on veteran support programs. But those could wait. Right now, in a small apartment in Columbus, something more important was happening. A family was healing, a hero was home, and somewhere, Barron thought, his grandfather was smiling. Later that evening, after Grace had fallen asleep and Sarah had shown her father the nursery she'd kept ready for him, just in case, Cooper finally took out Sarah's letter. He sat at the small kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Barron had stayed at Sarah's insistence, though he tried to give them privacy. But as Cooper began to read, his sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention. Dad? Sarah asked softly. Cooper laid the letter flat on the table. You knew, he said, looking at his daughter. You knew about Vietnam, about Fred Trump's unit. Sarah nodded. Mom told me before she died. She said you'd never gotten over what happened there, that sometimes, in your sleep, you'd call out their names. But how did she know? Because you saved my father that day, a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. President Trump stood there, having slipped in quietly with his security detail. Cooper immediately tried to stand at attention, but the president waved him down. Mr. President, Cooper began. My father wrote about you, the president continued, walking into the room. Every year on March 15th, he'd talk about the Marine who appeared out of nowhere, who got shot, pulling them to safety, who disappeared before they could even thank him properly. He pulled out an old, worn piece of paper. He wrote this, the day before he died. Asked me to keep looking. Cooper took the paper with shaking hands. I never wanted recognition. It was just what Marines do, Barron finished quietly. The same thing you did in Afghanistan, when you pulled those soldiers out of that burning vehicle and got shot again, Sarah added softly. History repeating itself. The president sat down at the table. My father spent years trying to find you, Mr. Cooper. He said he owed his life to a Marine who stood straight even in the middle of hell. He smiled slightly. Looks like that's a family trait. Cooper looked at his daughter, then back at the president. Sir, I don't deserve. You deserve everything we can give you, the president interrupted. And more. The Veteran Housing Initiative. My son started. It's being expanded nationwide. the James Cooper Veterans Program. Sir, please, I'm not a hero. Sarah touched her father's arm. That's exactly what you are. In Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and right here, right now. Coming back home? That took as much courage as any battlefield. Cooper's hand went to his. Purple Heart, hanging once again properly on his chest. Your grandfather, he said to Barron. He used to show us pictures of his family, said his greatest hope was that his children and grandchildren would understand the importance of helping others. He looked at Barron. Looks like he got his wish. Grace's cry came through the baby monitor, and Cooper stood up automatically. May I? He asked Sarah. Of course, Dad. She's already got you wrapped around her finger. As Cooper walked to the nursery, his posture straight, but his step lighter than it had been in years, Barron watched him go. The man who had been shivering in an alley just days ago was transformed, not just by the fresh clothes and haircut, but by the love of family and the weight of recognition finally given. You did good, son, the president said quietly to Barron. Your grandfather would be proud. He saved both our families, Barron replied. Grandpa's unit in Vietnam, those soldiers in Afghanistan. And now, by letting us help him, he probably saved countless other veterans who'll get help through his program. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. A hero's legacy. From the nursery came the soft sound of Cooper singing a lullaby, the same one he'd probably sung to Sarah all those years ago. His voice was rough, but full of love, the voice of a man who had finally found his way home. The January wind rattled the windows, but inside, warmth prevailed. A family had been reunited, a 50-year-old debt had been repaid, and a new generation, sleeping peacefully in her grandfather's arms, would grow up knowing that heroes sometimes need saving too. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness on a cold winter morning when a young man chose to step into an alley instead of walking by. Sometimes, Barron realized, the greatest acts of courage aren't on battlefields at all. Sometimes they're in the simple choice to stop, to help, to care, and sometimes they change everything. Thank you so much for sticking with this heartwarming story until the end. It's incredible how a simple act of kindness can reveal such deep connections and change so many lives. I'd love to hear what part of the story touched you the most. Where are you reading this from today? Drop your location in the comments below and let me know if you have any similar stories of unexpected kindness that brought people together. Every like and share helps spread this message of hope and reminds us that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed The Heart of Winter, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us of the power of human connection. Stay kind, and I'll see you in the next story. Remember, sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't on battlefields at all. They're in those simple moments when we choose to stop and help another human being.